In our MVC apps, the way that we interface with the database is by using Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework is an object relational mapping framework, and there's a lot of things that are built in that make interacting with the database fairly easy once you understand how everything works. Um, there's two different ways to bring in or create a database and tables when you're using Entity Framework Core. There's something called Code First, where it looks at your model and you perform data migrations, which end up creating the database. And the database is based on your models. So that is Code First, and that's the approach that we are going to be following today. The other approach is called Database First, and it's kind of the reverse. So the database already exists. And so what you have to do is create the models and the context class from the existing database. Okay, so it's kind of the reverse approach. And we will take a look at database first later in the semester. So features that you will find in Entity Framework are DB Context, which is a class, and DB Set. And we will be using DB Context to create our own context class, which will then be used to define our tables in our database. And we will also use it to seed the database with data. The data model is basically our C# classes. So each class will end up being a separate table in the database. So that is kind of important to think about when you are creating your classes. Okay? Being aware that your classes are going to end up being tables. Okay, so you want to remember all of those things that you learned in your relational database class and keep that in the back of your mind when you are creating your classes. The way that we interact with the database is using link to entity queries. So we are going to be using link, which was covered in the 195 class. So kind of you have to remember how link works. And we will be kind of reviewing some of that, but in the controller is where you will find all of the link code, okay? Because it's the controller's job to retrieve the data from the database and display it in a view, or if the view is creating a new row in the database, it is the controller's job to actually save that data into the database. So all the database commands for retrieval, all the CRUD functions are done in the controller. Migrations is what we do anytime we change a model. If that change is going to affect the database table, we have to do migrations and we have to update the database. Okay, so migrations initially are used to create the database, and then after that, we use them to update the database. So the code first approach, step by step, I've listed here for you. And this is what we are going to be following today. We are going to start by creating our models. Then we will install EF Core and EF Core tools. If they are already installed, then we will make sure that it is the correct version, because the version of EF Core has to match the version of .NET Core. After we make sure that Entity Framework is installed, we are going to create our context class, and then we'll add our seed values. And that's all in your context class file. Then we will go into app settings, and we will add the connection string to the actual database. So it's going to be looking at app settings to find out the name that we want for the database and where it's going to place that database when it's created. Then we modify our program CS file, and we enable dependency injection for the context objects. And basically, all dependency injection does is it ensures that the controllers have access to the objects that they need to interface with the database. After all of that, we're ready to do our migrations, and we do an add migration to actually create the files that will be used to, in this case, create the database. But once the database is created, if you do a migration, an add migration, it will update the database. So the first time, your initial creation, it is for creating the database. So we do an add migration, and then we do an update, and that will actually create the database. And then the easiest way to get controllers and views is to use scaffolding, which generates them. And then you can just go in and customize them and tweak them so that they function the way you want to. That is the easiest way to do it, and that is the way I'm going to show you. After that, we are going to modify the layout, which, as you remember, all of the views are pulled into the layout. So the layout does have a menu that it puts at the top of every page, and we will need to modify that menu to include the index of each of our new views. Then it's a matter of customizing the views and adjusting our URLs to make them user-friendly. So there's a little code that we can put in that will make our addressing, when you're keying in the address bar, it'll make those addresses appear more user-friendly. So in your projects, there are 3 files that contain information about the database and connection string. And those 3 files will be the context class, program CS, and app settings. As far as installing Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core and Core tools, we are going to use the NuGet Package Manager. And as I mentioned earlier, it is super important that Entity Framework Core, that version matches the version of your project. Okay, and so I'm actually going to be walking through that installation for this starter program. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to download this guy. Let me make sure I get this. I might have it in here already. No, I don't. Okay, so I'm just going to extract this. And let's open him up and go into the solution. So whenever you open a new project, you always want to do a build. because sometimes when things are pushed up to GitHub, there's some library files that might be missing. And this just ensures that the project has everything that it needs, and you should see that it was succeeded, your build succeeded. So that's kind of the first thing you want to do. And then what I need to do with this is install Entity Framework. So I'm going to move this over here. And there are two components in Entity Framework we need to get installed. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to Manage NuGet Packages. And so right now it goes in and shows you what's installed, and I got nothing installed. So I'm going to go over to Browse. And then I'm going to key in Microsoft.entity framework core dot, and I want SQL Server, and I can see it right here. Okay, Microsoft Entity Framework Core, SQL Server, that's the one I want. So the version of this program is .NET 6. And you can see this is 7, so they don't match. I have to go down and pick 6. And that is the one I'm going to install. Okay, and then in addition to doing the SQL Server, I also have to do tools. So let me just change this. Microsoft Entity Framework Core.tools. There it is. Here it is in my list. And I'm going to change this to version 6 and install it. And once you have it installed, then you should do a build. Okay, hopefully you see build succeeded. If you do install the wrong version, you know you can uninstall in here as well. If you uninstall, I would run a build and then install the correct version.